History of the Middle East with Dr. Brovkin, and today we continue talking about Abbasid dynasty and its decline during the Golden Age. So all of that is part of the Golden Age, and today we're going to talk about what happened after Caliph Muqtadir died, and this is going to be about his two caliphs that followed. One of his name is Al-Qahir. It's Qahir, Al-Qahir. He is the one to replace him in 932. Now, just a few words about Muqtadir. You remember that Muqtadir is already first indications of decline. You have all the problems we talked about before, which is the governor problem. Governors are pretty much becoming independent and splitting off. You have the succession problem, which means that there's not necessarily that a son succeed a caliph. He's chosen presumably by the preceding caliph, but in practice by the viziers. And you have corruption problem because mostly these government agencies he started selling for money, which of course leads to bad governance. Bad governance means neglected canals, irrigation. Bad governance, people are overtaxed. They pay too much money, but not all of that money is used for the benefit of the state. It's not passed on to the caliph. It is wasted by governors and other servants. And of course, there's a decline in morality. The caliphs are entertaining themselves in their palaces and neglect duties of government. So Muqtadir is killed in 932. And the person who, as I said, replaces him is Al-Qahir. Al-Qahir is very interesting, is not his son. He had a son, his name was Radi, but he was not chosen. The vizier chose Al-Qahir, who was a brother. So this is basically a very important example. This could not have happened under Rashid. In other words, the caliph decided who is going to be the successor, and then the brothers sometimes argued, but it was caliph's decision. Here you actually have a son who should have become a caliph, but he isn't. The choice is made in favor of the brother of the preceding caliphs, which basically shows the power of the viziers. So Al-Qahir becomes caliph. And the reason for that choice is because they're afraid that if Al-Radi becomes caliph, he would avenge those who had a conspiracy against his father. So in other words, he was killed, but this probably would have had an investigation, and people were scared what is going to happen, and so the deal is made that Al-Qahir becomes. Now, Al-Qahir becomes caliph, and he's very, very cruel. The descriptions of his cruelty are unparalleled to anything else we have seen or heard about Abbasid caliphs. So, one of the horrible things he did, he tortured the mother of Muqtadir and his sons. In order to get the money, where's the money hidden? So he was actually abused his own family to get the money. He also had another horrendous thing. One of the sons of Muqtadir, he had him walled alive. Now, walled, that means you put somebody. To wall alive means you put somebody in a room and you build a wall and there's no escape. There's no windows, there's no doors, there's no food, there is nothing. It's essentially a very painful, lonesome death from exhaustion and from lack of food and drink and air. It's a very cruel way of murder. Basically, to kill somebody is let them die being walled up in a room. So essentially, little by little, he made everybody so angry and so scared that there was a conspiracy against him, and he did not rule much. There was a new conspiracy formed, which shows us the political atmosphere in Baghdad. You have pretty much chaos. It's like there are conspiracies, there are murders, there's breaking of the laws of succession. Whoever is stronger appoints somebody to be caliph. It's a total mess. But in the end, they break into his room and they arrest him, but they didn't kill him. I don't know why. It's so interesting. The logical thing, they would have killed him, but they didn't. Instead, they blinded him. They poked his eyes. Essentially, they wanted him to experience the torture that he inflicted on others, so that he's alive and so that he knows what it's like to be tortured. So they blinded him, they poked his eye, and they put him in prison, in a solitary confinement, in a room, just like in a room that he walled up his nephew, but in a room where he could breathe and he could sit there all alone, so that he would experience the suffering. And he spent there 11 years, blinded. And then they released him. They just cannot let him go. And the story goes that he was going around Baghdad, a blind man in rags, like a pauper, like a beggar. And he was going around and saying, "I am a caliph, I am a caliph." Can you imagine the scene in the streets of Baghdad, an old man, blinded, with rags and very poor, goes around saying, "I am a caliph." That is the kind of a punishment that Al-Qahir got. And finally, we come to the last one. We're going to talk about also a very, very important reign that begins in 934, right after Caliph Al-Qahir is overthrown. You have Al-Radi, and that's the last one that we will discuss as the sort of end of the era. So Al-Radi reigned from 934 to 940, so that's 6 years, from 934 to 940. And he was a son of Muqtadir, and he comes to power. And he's not a bad man. They say he was pious, which means religious, and he was kind, but basically he was not strong enough to assert the power of the caliph. So in a sense, you have this splintering of authority and power continuing. On the one hand, you have more and more rebellions, and the territory controlled by the caliph in Baghdad is shrinking more and more. You do have, of course, independent Egypt that is taking over Syria. You have chieftains who are basically out of control in Arabia. So Arabia reverts to rule of tribal chieftain who would be subdued by the Fatimids in Cairo, not in Baghdad. And then you have Mosul that is de facto independent, Aleppo is de facto independent, and beyond the Tigris you have a dynasty that is ruling Persia. So in fact, it's a small portion of today's Iraq around Baghdad that is still under the power of Al-Radi, Abbasid Caliphate. Even Basra is out of control down the river where it flows into the Persian Gulf. So it's essentially splintering, but even with that territory, he is not a complete master. And he's completely controlled by his vizier, whose name is Ibn Raik. So it's the vizier, one more time, who basically usurps the power of the caliph, and the caliph cannot do much about it. Still, outwardly, life goes on as it was. You still have, and this is why they say it's the last time, you still have Friday prayers, you still have meetings of the philosophers and the poets, you still have sort of outwardly the palaces is there, the street life is there, the taxes are collected. I mean, it's much smaller than it used to be, but it's still, if you look at the way the city was, it's not yet totally different than it was. He has meetings of the Council of State. He continues to live pretty much the way it was before. But something important did happen that was new, that didn't happen again before. So that's a totally new page in the history of the Middle East. And that has to do with the name Hanbalis. And if you look him up in the Google, you would come up with the idea that it's a Sunni philosopher, and a very important one. But for our purposes as political event, you basically have, in modern terms, it could be called a rebellion of the Sunni Orthodox believers against the Mutazilites, against those who believe that Quran could be interpreted. And what they do, the first thing they do, and if you judge what they do, who they are by their actions, you will probably guess what kind of people these are. First thing they do, they smash bottles of wine. So wine is a taboo. If you're a good Muslim, there shouldn't be any wine. But then they proceed to smash something else: musical instruments, items of luxury, all these beautiful things that the Greek ambassadors described. They go on smashing those. Why? Because they think that that's not good Islam, that you should be modest, that you should not drink wine, you should not party with girls in harem, you should be strict, you should have 4 wives and not 100, you should live in a tent and not in 23 palaces. In other words, it's a kind of a radical reassertion of strict Islam against the Mutazilites. And with it also comes, they go overboard. They destroy musical instruments, but also they begin the persecution of the doctors. And several great doctors had to flee Baghdad because they're kind of like against science. They're against anything that smacks of frivolous, easygoing, kind of a celebration of life atmosphere, as was at Muqtadir and Mamun and Rashid. This whole era was, as I said, celebration of life and science and philosophy and poetry and beautiful women and wine. And for the people who are Orthodox Muslims, that was too much. And the reason this is such an important turn is because this is probably the turn when strict Islam is turning against science. Not because they find anything wrong with science, but because the people who do science are also people who like Aristotle and who like Greek things, which these people consider to be non-Muslim. If you like Aristotle, you're suspect because he's not Muslim, he's a pagan and he's foreign. So there's a beginning, a kind of a hostility to things non-Muslim, strictly defined. And of course they reverse. If under Mutazilites the Orthodox Sunnis were persecuted, now it's in reverse. And now these Orthodox Muslims begin to persecute Mutazilites and all these associated emblems and symbols of the Golden Age. So from that point of view, you actually have what we could call a kind of a double end of the Caliphate. Double means, on the one hand, it loses pretty much all the territories except Baghdad. They are on their own and they have their own culture, and it's a great culture. You will see that Golden Age continues in Cairo and in Syria, in Damascus. It goes on. There are new hospitals built and new universities open and canals are being built. The Golden Age just shifts. It sort of goes away from Baghdad. And in Baghdad, you have a kind of a reaction against it by the very strict interpretation of Islam and by the basically chaos of government that is controlled by viziers and the hired hands, the hired troops of the Turks. So from that moment on, you could kind of see Baghdad is losing its relevance. It is there, and it's going to linger on until the Mongols come, but it's no longer the center of Islamic civilization. If you want, you could say that the center of Islamic civilization shifts to Cairo and to Damascus one more time, as under Umayyads. So it is the Fatimid Caliphate that will preserve and continue the culture of the Golden Age. Thank you.